Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me today. And today I'm going to talk to you about Lilith. Now, there is an awful lot of information about Lilith, but most of it tends to be post-Hebrew, post-biblical information. That's because there's not a lot of information about her origins. The problem with the information that we have is that it really paints her in a very negative light. So it sees her as a dark, demonic creature. But she's older than that. She's older than those Hebrew biblical roots. So she goes back to ancient Sumerian times. That's where we've got the first written evidence about her. So Lilith, is she a goddess or is she a demon? Well, she is a goddess. She's categorically a goddess. And how do we know this? Because we found the cuneiform tablets with the writings from ancient Sumeria. These were the very first written records we have uncovered in time. There may be more, who knows, let's hope so. But on those records we have what is called the God list, where Lilith is mentioned. Now, you only get on the God list if you are a god or a goddess. So she is identified there as a goddess. But the strong likelihood is she goes back way, way further. We don't have those records. Prior to that, all our records were sculptural and pottery findings, burial findings, and evidence from the past that way, cave paintings and drawings. So we don't have any more written records to draw upon. But we do know that she was present in ancient Sumerian mythology. So the first reference we've got is of her as a wind demon. And then there is another story about her with the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, the same goddess. And that story goes that one day Inanna was walking along the river and she found a tree being washed away. So she got the tree, took it back to the garden, with the view that when it had grown, that she would have it cut down and made into a bed and a throne. When that time came, she found the tree was inhabited. So in the base of the tree, in the roots, was a snake, the snake that shall know no charm. In the branches at the top of the tree was the sacred Anzu bird, a mythological bird. And in the trunk was Lilith, a wind demon. So she is identified as a demon. Now this is the first time we see a garden with Lilith and a snake, and we know that we're going to see that a bit later on. So she gets her cousin Gilgamesh to come along and to cut down the tree. So Gilgamesh slays the snake and he scares off the bird, and Lilith, seeing this, runs away. There is a whole lot more mythology, symbolism that we could draw from this story, but that's a topic for another talk. So that's the second time we come across Lilith. The third time, she is seen as the handmaiden to Inanna Ishtar, and she is sent out to seduce men. Now we kind of have to avoid looking at these scenarios from today's judgments or values, because what would happen in the temples, in the goddess temples, and that is all the ancient temples, so we've got Inanna, Ishtar, Cybele, Demeter, they would have these sacred rites. It was a sacred marriage, and it was a very important fertility rite where it was believed that the goddess would come down and embody the priestess, and the god, the fertility god, would come down and embody the king. The king and the priestess would then engage in a sacred sexual union. And this was in order to bring fertility to the land. It was about ensuring they seeded the fertile land to bring forth growth for the community. So it had a very specific, sacred and functional meaning behind it. But you can see how later on, in more Christian times, how that sort of ceremony would have been perceived. So these three aspects of Lilith are important because it helps us to identify how her reputation evolves throughout the rest of her time. So if we move forward a little bit now to the Garden of Eden, and we have God. Now, in all the creation stories, wherever you look, we start with an androgynous God. It's a male and female. They create the gods, the pantheon, the gods and the goddesses, and they in turn create the mortals, because the gods need the mortals to worship them, because if they've no one to worship them, they have no purpose, and gods are very vain. So anyway, so the God creates Adam and Lilith. Now at this stage they're not in a human body, they are more, it's difficult to envisage what sort of a body they would be in, but it's not like a human body. But they were created as an androgynous being, until Adam decides he wants to be in charge. Look, I'm the man, I want to be in charge. And Lilith's saying, no, I'm sorry, that's not happening. We were created equally. I wasn't created superior, you weren't created superior, we're equal. So Adam's not having any of that. Big argument ensued, and Lilith said, I'm off, I'm not having any of this. She called out the ineffable name of God, and she left the garden. She was not banished, she was not thrown out, she chose to leave. So this was probably the first time anyone had actually defied the word of God. So Adam complained, Lilith's gone, and God sent 3 angels to fetch her back. They found her in the Red Sea and said, you've got to go back. God says you've got to go back. She refused. She said, I'm not going back. And they said, well, if you don't go back, we will destroy you. She said, well, you can't destroy me, because if you destroy me, you destroy creation. I am meant to be here. So the angels left. Now, I'm not going to talk about timings and eras here, because with mythology, the timings and eras get so skewed and mixed up all the time. But it's safe to say that at some point in the story, God empowered Lilith to be his lash, to create, to do his bidding. So that is one part of the story. Meanwhile, back in the garden, all was not well. Adam was still unhappy, he had no Lilith, and he was feeling a bit lonely. So he complained bitterly to God, and God put him into a sleep, sawed him in half, separated the male and female side of him, and created Eve. So we now have Adam and Eve in a human body. Then everything's happy in the garden, they're all well, Eve's wandering around the garden, and a snake appears, well, a tree appears, and then a snake around the tree. And the snake speaks to Eve. Now, this is always an interesting point, because often the snake is seen as the devil, but the devil hadn't been created at this point. The snake was an ancient primordial being. He was an embodiment of the goddess, and the goddess would often use a snake form to speak to mortals. On top of that, the tree is an embodiment of the goddess, so the chances that Lilith was the snake is pretty high. So the snake says to Eve, why don't you eat from this tree? And Lilith says, no, I can't eat from that tree because I'll die. She says, no, you won't die. Eat from this tree. This is a good tree. And Lilith says, no, God's told me that if I eat from that tree, I'll die. I can eat from anywhere else. And the snake says, you will not die, but your eyes will be opened and you will see as God sees. You will know right and wrong. You will know everything you need to know. So Eve takes the fruit, takes a bite. Suddenly her eyes are open. She has the knowledge that she didn't have before. She tempts Adam. He takes a bite, and we all know what happens after that. So Adam and Eve are now, their role in the creation has now changed somewhat. They have sinned against God. So meanwhile, I want to bring in another character called Lamashtu. Now Lamashtu also predates this period. She goes back to Sumerian time, and she's identified as a demon, and a pretty nasty, horrible demon at that. She's a terrifying creature to look at. She's really, really fearsome, and she likes to eat babies, chew on their bones, cause miscarriages, pull fetuses out of the womb, sleep with men when they are sleeping alone in the house. She was a succubi. There was nothing nice about her. We don't know whether that character was true to her or whether that was, again, embellished, but she does go back to the time when Lilith was identified, and there is a school of thought that thinks that sees that Lamashtu and Lilith could be sisters. I can't comment on any validity of that, but her reputation was not a good one. Suddenly and gradually over time, Lilith now becomes equated with Lamashtu. So whereas Lamashtu does all these terrible things, Lilith now is seen as killing babies, causing miscarriages, killing mothers in childbirth, and for the men who are foolish enough to sleep in the home alone at night, going into their beds and stealing their seeds so that she can then give birth to 100 demons a night. Her reputation now has taken on a really dark turn. So hundreds, if not thousands, of bowls have been found, just simple pottery bowls, and inside there would be an inscription encircling it outwards, and sometimes with an image of a demon or Lilith in the bottom, and it would be a prayer or a hymn against Lilith to protect and to stay away from the family, particularly around childbearing time. So these would be placed upside down around the home in order to trap the demon. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that child mortality was very, very high at this point. And apart from the fact they didn't have the medical knowledge that we do now, there was also the fact that many of the girls that were giving birth were very, very young, were children themselves often, and other women had multiple births. So both of those factors had an influencing effect on child and mother mortality. However, this carried on. So suddenly there's all these terrible deaths in childbirth, and it's Lilith's fault. It's the demon that's causing this. There's no natural causes for this. It's the demon. So Lilith's reputation increased and got darker. The story about her origins even changes again. Whereas she was created as an equal to Adam, then a new story emerges where Adam was created from the earth and she was created from the filth and the slime and the dirt. So everything that could be thrown at Lilith to make her unsavoury, horrible, terrifying was. Then time goes on, and Lilith, it's worth pointing out at this point that there are lots and lots of gods and goddesses throughout history, throughout mythologies, and often they have their stories stay with them, and often they are merged and morphed with other names. So we have Inanna becomes Ishtar, becomes Astarte, becomes Aphrodite, and so forth, and Dumuzi becomes Tammuz, becomes Apollo. That's happens widely across the mythological world. But Lilith's name never changes. She was Lilith at the very beginning, right through to present day. When we then start to move fast forward quite a bit further, we start to go towards the witch trials, and already the reputation of Lilith and the perceived sin of Lilith and of Eve has tainted women. Every woman that is going to be born in for the rest of time. So they're tainted by that, and it was reinforced that women were more susceptible to demonic possession or demonic influences, that they were weaker than men, that they couldn't protect themselves, and therefore they had to be looked after by the men, controlled by the men. Now this wasn't just written in sacred texts, and it was in sacred texts, it was written in political law and statute. So a woman had nowhere to go. And when it got to the witchcraft trials, of course, that reputation didn't help, because that really reinforced the nature of women, and of course Lilith became more and more associated with the devil. And in fact, I remember, because I was brought up a Roman Catholic, and I'd never heard of Lilith, and by the time I did hear of her, which was I was a young adult, you weren't supposed to mention her name. You couldn't even mention that name. It was too dangerous. It carried on again into the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Women weren't strong enough to be educated. They weren't capable to have property. They had to go from the father's house to the husband's house, or if they didn't marry, then they had to be looked after by a brother or uncle or a male cousin or whatever, because they didn't have the wherewithal or the strength to look after themselves. So this was a long effect from the very beginning, where women were kind of suppressed down. But it kind of got into pop culture and literature as well. In the majority of things where you see, whether it's in gaming or pop culture or books or films, the majority, with the one or two exceptions, Lilith is seen as evil. She's often seen equated with the devil, and that's another story for another day, because I will be doing a podcast on that. But then in the 70s, in the 1970s in America, there were a group of Jewish women who were fed up of feeling dominated. They were fed up of being told what to do, what they should be, how they should act. And they rebelled against that, and they wanted to revisit some of the stories that had come out of the Bible, because, as I said, the Bible had been rewritten hundreds of times. Apart from the mistranslations, there were deliberate changes, and those changes were used to control society. So there was a political bent on those changes, as well as a religious ones, and you didn't have anywhere to go. You had to fit in, and you had to conform, or you were severely punished. So we had this group of Jewish women who then they looked at the different stories, and they looked at Lilith in particular and said, this isn't right. Some of the stories about her, some of the texts that have been written about her are clearly satirical and are clearly not worth what they're written on. And we want her truth to be told. We want the story of her truth. We want you to know who she really is. They published a journal called Lilith, and they had festivals and fairs where they promoted Lilith as a beacon of equality. Now, Lilith never wanted superiority. Adam wanted superiority. Lilith wanted equality. That's all she wanted. She didn't want anything else. She wanted equality. And so she was held up as a beacon of equality, a beacon of feminism, and a goddess. So she started life as a goddess in our very first written records, and she was completely vilified and demonized, and a complete character assassination. Her character was methodically and strategically trashed, and then she came full circle to becoming held up as a beacon for women and of equality and a goddess. So her story is quite a powerful one, and with the suppression of one half of the feminine half really resulted in the suppression of everybody. Everybody suffered. It wasn't just women. Men suffered. There were different ways, but equally women felt the brunt of it because they had their rights taken away completely, and in some cases that's still happening today, as we know. But so what we saw as Lilith being independent and saying this is what I want was changed to be seen as rebellious and disobedient. What we saw as Lilith's sexuality became sinful and unclean, and what we saw as her exercising her right to say no, exercising her right to choose, became a crime. And if we look at those very early stories of her, she was a goddess. She was a winged goddess, and we equated her with all the goddess things. But then she became a wind demon in the Sumerian stories, so that was something to build on. You could create an evil demon. And as a handmaiden, she went off to seduce men. That became promiscuous. So all her positive attributes were transferred into negative ones. And of course, all the things that the later biblical teachings squashed down. Sexual feelings were bad, and they would create this persona of her that was nothing like the actual persona of Lilith when she was first identified as a goddess. So in a nutshell, that is Lilith. I mean, this is about her sacred truth, really. This is about setting her story right again, and to see her as what she was. She was the one that said, no, I'm not accepting this. This is not what I want. This is not good for me, so I'm not going to accept it. She wasn't going to stand for it. She was the one who would rather live alone in the wilderness than live in a gilded cage with everything that she could possibly need. And she was the one who stood up for her own independence on her own rights. So I've got a lot more to say about Lilith. There is so much more. This is just a kind of a taster, if you will, and I will be doing more, but it gives you a little bit of a taster about who she was, where she came from, and what we know about her already. And I find it very frustrating that I mean, there are some wonderful books and lots of information, but what I find frustrating is it all tends to be from the post-Hebrew biblical stories, because that is the majority of what we've got. But what I'd like is for people to not take that as representative of who Lilith was, because I don't think it's representative of her at all. I just think that let's go back to the very first writings where she appears on that God list. And I've got quite a lot more to say about it, and I will be doing, but that's where we are today. So thank you for joining me, and if you have any comments or any questions, please feel free to message me or email me. You can get me through Facebook or through our website, and the details will be at the end of this video, and I will speak to you soon. Bye.